Welcome to the C Analysis podcast. I'm your host, Chaz Nuttycombe, the director of C Analysis. I'm joined here by Ben Tribbett, a Democratic consultant from Fairfax, Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. He is a Democratic consultant with Pocket Aces Consulting. He also is in my field of predicting elections. I will say that he, in 2019, bested me in the state Senate. Ben, you got State Senate District 7 right, which is Frank Wagner's open seat. Jen Kiggins held that seat for her party. I thought it would flip. I don't remember what your prediction was for State Senate District 12, though. I think you had it as toss-up in the final rating, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think Chaz, my ratings in 2019 were 100% on in the state Senate, and then missed a couple in the state House.
Yeah. Okay. I beat you in the House, but you best me in the Senate. So, right. But I will say, with the House, I think it's going to be a little bit harder to predict this year. We have a new president in office. It'll be interesting to see who's nominated for both parties, the Democrats and Republicans. And we're going to get a little bit into the Democratic side for all the primaries, since that is your wheelhouse. So I want to get right into it. For the governor primary, you have former Governor McAuliffe, Jennifer Carroll Foy, the former delegate, Delegate Lee Carter, Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax, and State Senator Jennifer McClellan. What are your thoughts on the primary right now? I know there have been the last two polls that have come out for that primary have not really shown that McAuliffe has it on the lock. Of course, he has a wide lead, given his name recognition being the former governor. But what do you think? How do you see the primary in its current form? Do you think it's all definitely going to be McAuliffe, or do you think one of these other candidates has a chance to break through?
I think there's opportunity for people to get traction, but Terry's starting out with a humongous lead, not just in money, but in name identification. I think Virginia is a state that, especially the Democrats, are overwhelmingly happy with the elected officials that they have representing them. And it's a state that's very much a status quo electorate. And I'm not sure that any of the change issues have really caught fire or resonating to make, a candidate get the type of traction they would need to defeat a former governor. So I think Terry's pretty much a substantial favorite at this point, particularly with the field split otherwise in different directions for his opposition.
Yeah. And one of the things I think is with the governor primary, especially, and attorney general primary, which we'll get into, but I will say, and this is my opinion, I'm glad that the gloves are off in public. Usually with Democratic primaries here in Virginia, not to say all primaries are bloody behind closed doors, but the contest can get really just passive aggressive in public. But Jennifer Carroll Foy has shown that she has her gloves off. McAuliffe and his campaign has kind of retorted, flexing their muscle. You can look at Brandon Jarvis's reporting on Clinton Jenkins being forced to switch sides in his endorsement, going from Carroll Foy to McAuliffe. But yeah, I would also agree, McAuliffe's definitely the prohibitive favorite. Going into the lieutenant governor primary, it is very much a clown car. There's so many people in it. You got Ayala, Goldman, Guzman, Levine, Rasul, Warren, Perryman. And I will say Perryman, I definitely underestimated his campaign starting out, but I think he's built a pretty good campaign for himself. Do you think there's anybody that has a slight edge in that primary at all? Or do you think it's really just too early to kind of determine that?
I mean, I think it's very early to determine that. I think if you look at the straw polls around the state, especially in Northern Virginia, Sam Rasul's been pretty strong among the activist community. Obviously, if it was a convention, I think he might be the favorite. But in a primary that the electorate's so large, I think a lot of this is going to come down to, voters making their minds up late. And I think some of it will, for lieutenant governor, have a lot to do with who they're supporting for governor and what kind of ticket that voter wants to sort of form in their mind. I mean, as you know, Chaz, there are only some states that elect the governor and lieutenant governor separately.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, voters become the political analysts as well as voting for who they like. And so someone who's voting for Terry McAuliffe may want to see more diversity down the ticket. Maybe that's a minority candidate. Maybe that's a female candidate. You might also see some people who might be voting for one of the Jennifers, wanting to regionally balance, right? So different voters may take different things in account of how they want to balance out that ticket. And I think the lieutenant governor's race will settle more when we see, exactly what the breakdown of the governor's race will look like.
Mm-hmm. Who in the race for lieutenant governor would you say, if you had to pick, is probably the most progressive? I think one of the unique stances that Perryman's taken is on Chap Peterson, saying that Peterson needs to be primaried. But I think Rasul and Guzman are also kind of angling for that title. Do you have an opinion on who you think would be the most progressive?
I think that there are different types of progressives. I think Guzman is a Bernie style progressive.
Mm-hmm.
I think Sam Rasul is more of a outsider change type of progressive. And I think that Sean Perryman is, I know the word everyone uses now is progressive. I would say, he might be more of a classic liberal than the other two, where I think progressive, you think of sort of in the modern construct, in the recent presidential campaigns, progressives were sort of the change candidates, the anti-establishment.
Right.
And I think Perryman, while he's, and not necessarily pro-establishment, I think he is very much more of like a classic liberal than just a progressive in the way that we think of progressives, because he doesn't have a natural arm in the progressive movement in the way that Elizabeth does with Bernie, or that Sam does sort of with the environmental activists, but he's very much on the left.
Mm-hmm. Going into the attorney general primary, speaking of, going against the establishment and whatnot, you have Delegate Jay Jones going up against Mark Herring. Jones just scored an endorsement from Governor Northam, which at least to me was a surprise. Although I guess maybe Northam did not appreciate Herring calling for his resignation while calling that's the pot calling the kettle black there, as we found out a few days later. Jones has scored a lot of endorsements in the General Assembly. I believe Herring still has more endorsements in the state Senate, I think by just one more. But do you think that Herring is very much at risk? I would still say he's a favorite, given he's been elected statewide twice, and he's won a Democratic primary before. But do you think that especially the blackface scandal from his early days will be a factor in the votes of Virginia Democratic primary voters? Do you think that Jones is really running to his left, or do you think it's more so of wanting to turn a new page?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd start by saying, if you remember the Herring scandal, it was not a blackface scandal as he described it. It was a brown makeup scandal, I believe is how he put it into his press release.
Yeah.
And look, I think that that's going to be a problem for him because of the way that he addressed it. I think that Herring, in the way that he came at that, sort of taking I wasn't as bad as what Ralph did by making those types of differentiations at the time, might have saved him a little heat in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
But in the long term, I don't think that people are going to reflect well back on, that type of differential between, no, I didn't do blackface, but I did brown makeup. That having been said, the thing that Herring has going for him in this primary, and as you said, he's run twice before statewide and won, is that he's been a very progressive attorney general. He's made a lot of accomplishments. I mean,
mm-hmm.
I know anything would look progressive after Ken Cuccinelli had been the attorney general.
Yeah.
And so there were certainly lots of layups to make, but he's made those layups plus some. He's been regularly on the news making change and garnering goodwill with progressive and liberal primary voters all over the state. And so, overcoming that in a primary like this, the Northam endorsement certainly helps lift Jay up. But we have to see, how much money are both of them going to be able to raise? Remember, Virginia is an uncapped state. So,
right.
If Jay's able to get one donor, I think we all know his likely name, to come in and help him as a sort of anti-dominion, anti-establishment candidate to the tune of, 7 figures, I think he could make a real race of this.
The same donor that gave $500,000 to Sally Hudson.
I hear that there are some large donors in the Charlottesville area, right? Like they really care about politics all over the state. And so, but if they come in and they invest, $150,000 behind Jay, well, that sounds like a lot of money in a statewide race. That's not a lot of money. A week of Northern Virginia network TV at the end of this primary is going to run someone almost $700,000 for a decent sized buy. And so if you want to run a month of TV in Northern Virginia, you're going to get closer to $3 million for a month
Yeah.
of TV. And if Jay Jones was up on TV in Northern Virginia for the last month with a good contrast with Herring and $3 million behind him in that, I think he'd make a real race of this. He might even be a little favorite, but favored by a little. But I think that I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think that you're going to have I don't think you're going to have either one of them vastly outspending the other.
Right.
I think this is one of those things where when you see these sort of heavyweights go up and head to head in a primary, sometimes those things can explode, and they tend to explode when they're self-funding candidates because everyone keeps topping each other. When you have benefactor candidates, people that have, large donors that can, fund big chunks of the campaign, they tend to be much more cautious of waiting to see what the other side is doing before they try to match it. And so while this could turn into a huge race on either side because of the, entities that are backing Mark and Jay, I don't know if it will. And if it doesn't, I think that really advantages Mark Herring.
Okay. Well, let's get into the House of Delegates contest this year. There are quite a few. I want to start off with House of Delegates District 31. Delegate Guzman, who's running for lieutenant governor, is double filing here in Virginia. You can double file if you're running statewide. You can also file for a House delegate seat, for example. I know Glenn Davis did that in his 2017 lieutenant gubernatorial bid, in which he fell short. What do you think of that? Because I know that Guzman made that decision to double file kind of at the last second there. She's got 3 other people running in that seat. Of course, we'll see, who actually has their ballot, their signatures in. But what do you make of that contest? Do you think there could be a situation where maybe the voters will vote for her at the top of the ticket, or near the top of the ticket for her lieutenant gubernatorial bid, but maybe vote for someone else in the House of Delegates contest?
Yeah, man, I think so. As you point out, Chaz, this is fairly new of people doing this. When Glenn Davis did it, he was unopposed, so we didn't get good numbers on that.
Right.
My gut says that you're more likely to see a problem for a candidate, or the biggest problem, if they're doing poorly in their legislative district, down ballot, to get people to flip back to them, and that people that do well in their legislative races, or their statewide races up ballot, probably have some more margin of error down ballot. So I think a lot of how you would calculate out the 31st race, or even the 50th, where there's a primary for Lee Carter's seat, and I think he's also double filing, right?
Yeah, he is.
And Mark Levine, same thing in Alexandria, who's double filing. I think so. Those are the only 3 I think that are in the lieutenant governor's race. They're double filing, that are contested. Yeah. And is Rasul double filing? But he's not contested, right?
Rasul, yeah, I don't think Rasul is contested, but okay, he is also double filing.
Okay, but not yet contested. So just take the 3 that are contested. If you look at the numbers, you have to assume of those 3, the person who's likely to do the worst up ballot in their own district is probably Lee Carter, because the governor's race is going to be especially hard to break through in. And I don't think that Lee has enough of a constituency in Manassas to overcome. He's never been contested in a primary until his last one. His first time he was unopposed, and his last one, I think he won with 52% against a pretty weak candidate in 2019. So he's never been contested in a what I would call a real way. And I don't know if this is a real challenge or not, but if, say, he gets 5% of the vote for governor in his district, or 10%, he's going to have to flip a lot of people from up ballot to him down ballot.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bigger ask than just asking them to support him down ballot when they just voted you down in a statewide. Whereas if you're running statewide and you're losing statewide, but you're winning your district, you may have more success. And so I think part of the issue of double filing is you really get pulled in both directions. Presumably, if, let's use Elizabeth Guzman for an example, if she was not double filed, then you probably would have a lot of very favorable comments about her from all the candidates for her House seat, saying that she had been a great delegate and they need to follow her as delegate, which would also enhance her own numbers in her delegate seat for the lieutenant governor's race. Now that she's double filing, she not only has, 7 others swatting at her in a statewide race, she's got 3 people in her home base eating at her support, knocking on doors, talking with people. I think this is a real problem for the candidates that are double filing. I know it's allowed, but it's never been contested before. And I think you've got to put all three of them on a real watch list. If I were advising any of the three of them, I would tell them that if you don't get at least 60% of the vote in your statewide race in your district, you should consider yourself extremely endangered in the House race.
Okay. We've now knocked out those ones, the ones where you have double filings. Let's get into some of those where you just have an incumbent who is getting a primary. House of Delegates District 34, Kathleen Murphy, who flipped this seat in 2015 after Barbara Comstock was elected to Congress in 2014, is getting a primary from her left in Jennifer Ardeli. What do you make of that race? This is a very kind of wealthy, and I would definitely say moderate district. I know Biden, if I recall correctly, dominated in the Democratic primary here last year. And I think Northam did very well here as well. So it's not like there is much of an appetite in its Democratic primary voters for progressive politics. Do you think there's a chance that Ardeli can beat Murphy?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play here, right? And starting with, I'm not sure that Ardeli is more progressive than Murphy. I think she's more progressive in rhetoric than Murphy. But Murphy's record in the General Assembly, along with almost all the other Democratic incumbents, has been one of a ton of progressive progress in the last 2 years. Getting people to out progressive some of these incumbents is, I think, a real challenge when you get beyond rhetoric. And I think that, someone can come out and say, I'm more progressive or energetic or whatever their campaign is, but then proving that to the voters and demonstrating that in an election, I think they're going to find that it's going to be very thin in terms of what things they have to point at. It's been Kathleen is, from my vantage point, I didn't follow every vote in the General Assembly, been pretty much a mainstream Democrat in terms of voting for all these different initiatives the Democrats have put through. So I think that this is, there's been some cycles in the last few years where being the most progressive has been a way to get elected in a Democratic primary. I'm not sure that this cycle is exactly that. I think that you have a lot of incumbents with really good records that have been around for a long time and had a lot of success, going up and challenging them, whether you're talking about, we'll group all these together, whether you're talking about a Kathleen Murphy or a Kay Corey or a Patrick Cope, they're all doing basically the same thing, right? I mean, they're all voting for, in all three of their cases, because they've been down there a while, having leadership roles in pretty major legislation. And so I think it's a very tough argument to make, to say that someone's more progressive than them because they come in and put out a statement on something. This legislature we just have gotten out of for the last 2 years is without question the most progressive Virginia legislature in history. I mean, this is not close. So coming in with a message of I'm more progressive than the most progressive legislature in history, I think is a tough argument to make without specific votes to point to that an incumbent cast that were bad. I think.
Well, I think there can be maybe one exception to this. One primary you missed when listing off, you got Hope and Murphy and Corey. Lopez is one of them, and I think he's got a pretty Alfonso Lopez, and he did get a primary in 2019, but he didn't really. His primary opponent didn't really run a campaign, but I think the primary opponent got about a quarter of the vote. Whereas this time, I think his primary opponent is actually, running a campaign. Now, do I think that, Lopez is underdog? No, absolutely not. Not right now. But, I think that is an area because, as you know, with the whole detention center thing, I think there's definitely an area in which in that seat, a progressive can maybe break through and kind of, point out flaws in a Democratic, especially, since Lopez is up in leadership, point out in their record and show this is not, I'm more progressive than this person, given what they've done. What do you think of Lopez's race and his primary opponent this time around?
Yeah, I thought she had a really interesting announcement video. I think same idea as what we talked about with the other incumbents. It's more challenging this year. Obviously, his district is a little bit different. South Arlington is a low turnout area, and so there might be some more opportunities for a challenger to overtake him that was able to energize more people to come out and vote than what normally votes in his district. But again, I think that from any delegates that have been enacting the legislation they've been enacting the last couple of years, and part of that, and Lopez is part of that team also, are going to be difficult to beat unless there are special circumstances in their district. Now, in Lopez's district, you could get some special circumstances around his previous work with ICE, but that's already been litigated in the last primary. So I think his opponent's going to have to figure out how she wants to relitigate that effectively.
Well, I mean, again, with it's not like JD Spain really ran much of a campaign. So, was it litigated? Yeah, but it wasn't like it was, Spain really made it that much.
It's also older. It's also older news now, right?
Yeah,
and I think it's probably less toxic than when you're talking about, ICE under Trump. I think that probably is a less toxic term now that Biden's president. But and then the other issue that she has going for her is, Amazon moving into Arlington, and there's some progressive energy around that. That having been said, we saw that some of that progressive energy that was in New York around Amazon ended up causing them to lose the deal. And I think that has tamped down on the amount of progressive energy there has been against Amazon in Arlington, because they know they could still potentially lose it if they pushed it too far. So it's an interesting primary. Look, it's probably the most interesting of the inside the Beltway ones.
Yeah, I would say so as well.
There's challenges. I think the most vulnerable of the incumbents that are not running statewide would be Ibrahim Samira. And the reason I would say that he's the most vulnerable is because he's run the least. So, I think he was unopposed in 2019 in the general. He ran in that special election when Jennifer Boysko moved up earlier in the year to the state Senate, and then he ran for her seat. And obviously had a contested caucus and then a special election. But I believe he was unopposed in November. And running in a special election are much lower turnout. There's a lot fewer people who know who you are. And so that one's going to have much more of a vibe of an open seat race with an incumbent than it would in other districts. I think he has, an advantage being the incumbent, but he has less of an advantage than other incumbents do from the start. And you can see that from the endorsements that are coming out. I think of the 7 people on the Herndon Council, including the mayor, Ibrahim got 4 and Irene got 3. That's something that you would more typically see in an open seat race where you see a split. With an incumbent, generally, you would see people endorse the incumbent or stay out. And so that just tells you that the vibe there is much more like an open seat race than an incumbent. And so that one, I would say, is one to watch as well.
Would you say that he's getting a primary from his right in that seat? I mean, he is. I would say, when it comes to when I think off the top of my head of the House Democratic Caucus, I would say Samir is probably the second most left in the caucus, with Carter being the most left.
Certainly by rhetoric. I assume that the challenge is from the right, Chaz, but I'm not sure that it's entirely ideological. I think it's also personality driven. And look, Irene, I think, moved in the district fairly recently. And so this isn't the ideal primary challenge, but when you get challengers, you tend not to be able to put together the perfect challenger. You go with what you got. And in Irene's case, she's done politics. She knew what she was getting into, presumably that she's going to have a campaign plan around how she's going to introduce herself to voters. So given the fact that she seems to know what she's doing, or at least has some sort of vision for her campaign, I think that will be a positive for her. She obviously had some local supporters lined up before she was running with these endorsements. So let's see how it plays out. That's one that I think you always want to call an incumbent the favorite unless there's a reason not to. And so I would call Ibrahim the favorite. But I do think it will be interesting and one to watch.
One seat that is kind of a clown show, honestly, with the Democratic primaries, House of 66. That is Kirk Cox's seat, which is open. The Democrat, I'm expecting them to recruit someone else into this seat because you've got 3 pretty weak candidates in that seat, and we moved that from tilt Republican to lean Republican as a result, given where it is. Because even if, let's say the House Democratic Caucus does get someone pretty good for this seat, you still got 3 other people in this race. Sheila Bynum Coleman she was the nominee in 2019. And so I think that's, given that, it's going to be primary, that's definitely good for her. What are your thoughts on that one? Because that is supposed to be, Kirk Cox is not double filing. That's supposed to be the best pickup opportunity for the Democrats in the House, but it really seems like they're fumbling it.
Well, look, I think there's still time left to go. I think we've got a couple of weeks. It's very easy to qualify in a House of Delegates race. So let's see who ends up getting in the field. And I would just say, we've had this before where the candidates have seemed sort of weak. And when you get to a general election, some of that can dissipate away if the party's doing well at top of the ticket. Look, I remember a Northern Virginia race we had a few years ago where people thought that the Senate candidates, the two that were running, were both completely underwhelming and that it would be impossible to beat the incumbent. And, one of them won the primary and then ousted the incumbent because it was a good year for Democrats. So I think this race is going to, in the fall, hinge on what kind of environment it is. And all over the state, the Republicans are having a lot of trouble with recruitment. I think that type of candidates they're putting forward are not the type of profiles you expect to go pick up marginal legislative seats, but look like the kind of desperate candidates of, you don't have a candidate on the ballot, you had to find somebody. I mean, candidate, I think it's, I can't remember if it's House District 2 or if it's 28 with Josh Cole, was like a family foundation volunteer. They're just
28.
28. Yeah. It's not, they're not coming up with, impressive credentialed candidates, from the community. They're coming up with like right-wing activists to go field on the ballot. And that's going to be a problem for them everywhere. And I think that the Democratic candidates will benefit from that.
What do you think about House District 68 with Dawn Adams versus Kyle Elliott? I know Adams had a few scandals in 2019, but, again, like you said before, time has passed, and I don't think really Democratic primary voters are going to think about that. She did flip this seat. She's been elected in it twice. It will be, I am very much interested to see who the Republicans nominate in that seat. You have the famous local pariah, Mike Dickinson, running for that seat. And we'll see if he becomes nominee. I know Republicans recruited someone else in that seat recently. But what do you think of that Democratic primary between Adams and Elliott?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts on this. Obviously, there's two different primaries going on in the Richmond area with incumbents. I think Adams is more, I've liked what I've seen out of Kyle so far, but I think Adams is a stronger favorite in her primary just because of the district demographics. I think where Betsy Carr has her biggest challenge is that the demographics of the district are overwhelmingly African-American in the primary, and she's not. And I think that this is a time where there are a lot of people that are thinking that we need to have more representation for communities of color in the General Assembly than less. And so it's just not a good time politically to be a white incumbent in a majority minority district. I view that one as being much more endangered, where Betsy has to really make a case for herself than Dawn Adams has just demographically. And I think that one of the things you have to remember too about like Richmond area primaries, Richmond voters pay much more closer attention to issues out of Richmond and General Assembly and state issues than other places in the state. And they know who's running for state offices. They know who's running for local offices. In Richmond in the, mayoral election in 2016, Joe Morrissey won a lot of the minority neighborhoods and LeVar Stoney won a lot of the white neighborhoods. Right. So it's not always as simple as just who's the white candidate and who's the black candidate.
Right.
But it does matter. And I think especially in this time, it matters. And so I would say that, I'd put Betsy's race in the, very competitive zone. And I would put the race with Dawn Adams probably, as being Dawn's advantage. But if Kyle can make a case, I think he could make a run at her. But I think that she starts out with an advantage.
I mean, yeah, since the death of George Floyd, black candidates have done especially well in Democratic primaries throughout the country. That's state legislatures, that's Congress, U.S. Senate ones. The DSCC lost their 10-year streak of winning Democratic primaries for the candidates they endorsed in Tennessee with, I forget her first name, but I know her last name was Bradshaw. And she dominated in that primary. That was probably the best example of that last year. So I think you've got a pretty good point with Carr's race. What I will say though is that Black Democratic primary voters are very incumbent friendly, and I think her primary challenger is, I think, to the best of my knowledge, trying to run to her left. I know last year he, if I recall correctly, came out in support of defunding the police. But, we'll see what angle he has. He doesn't have to. Black voters in Democratic primaries are usually pretty moderate. You can look at the Lacey Clay, Cori Bush primary, especially, for example. Cori Bush won that primary because she dominated with white voters and did not get blown out with black voters in the Democratic primary the second time around. So I definitely agree with that one, House District 69. Another one where you have a black candidate going against a white incumbent would be House District 79. What are your thoughts on that one? That is Steve Heretic versus Nadarius Clark. Heretic has been, kind of bucking with his party at times. I think the best example would be when the Democrats are trying to draw a map in 2018 with redistricting, and he was just like, "This is a gerrymander," and then Northam canceled a fundraiser with him. Of course, there are other examples as well, but he's one to buck with his party at times. He's pretty much a straight shooter.
Well, a couple things on that, Chaz. I would say he bucks his party actually on a lot of legislative votes. Of the ones that I noticed during the session, I would say that Steve Heretic was the number one House incumbent who bucked the leadership from the right. Obviously there's some liberals like Lee Carter and Ibrahim Samira who are bucking the leadership sometimes from the left.
Mm-hmm.
But he was bucking it from the right. And on quite a number of votes that I noticed, including some key things that didn't get through. So my understanding is there's a third candidate who's running there now as well, which complicates matters for beating him. But Heretic on paper, I think, is one of the more vulnerable House incumbents. If someone could put together a really good effort against him, especially considering the fact that of those voters in his district, a lot of them were new and added in that redistricting when the judges ordered new lines. And so he's never run, contested to a decent chunk of his district. It used to be the 79th was almost entirely Portsmouth when Johnny Giuano represented it for years, and it was a Portsmouth-based seat. Now the largest chunk of population is in Chesapeake. There's actually more registered voters in Chesapeake City than in Portsmouth, and a big chunk in Norfolk. I think it's something like 39, 33, 27 in terms of registered voters. So it's going to require a lot more navigating across jurisdictional lines, which in Hampton Roads, the world changes when you cross the jurisdictional line.
I think that, it's a pretty good point. He has a new district, especially, and he will have to try and communicate with those new voters in the Democratic primary. But, you have I didn't know that there was another candidate who got in that race.
At least that, the other candidate, I can't remember his name, but is at least announced on Facebook. But as you said earlier, sometimes they don't always qualify. So we'll see who actually makes the ballot.
3 more primaries. House of 71, that's Jeff Bourne. He's getting a primary from someone, if you know anything about that. I think Bourne is...
anything about that, but I would just say right off the top that, before I even know who's challenging him, that Jeff Bourne strikes me as one of the least vulnerable members of the House of Delegates, period.
Yeah, he's pretty good with, his constituency. I think it would be hard to beat him. I don't think he's really in much danger either. House District 47, that's Patrick Hope's seat.
We talked about that one earlier.
Yeah. All right. The last primary would be House District 84. It's kind of a similar situation of 66, where you got three Democratic candidates. But I would say, and this is Glenn Davis' seat. We'll see if Glenn Davis becomes the lieutenant gubernatorial nominee for the Republicans or not in May. I think it's going to be him or Hugo. But, in 66, they have pretty weak candidates. Whereas I would say, 84, they've got at least, they've got some decent candidates. What do you think of that one, if you know anything much about it?
Look, I expect this to be where Action Central happens. I haven't seen any of the candidates in the 84th yet that have distinguished themselves where I would say, oh, that person's going to win. But I expect this to be a key central race in November and fought out very much on partisan lines.
Okay. All right. Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. I will make sure to touch base with you again closer to June, when we are about to approach the Democratic primaries, and hopefully squeeze some final predictions out of you in some of those races.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me on, Chaz.